The final opportunity to get rich has arrived. There's no time left. You'll realize that everyone with some money in the world is now racing against time to restructure their assets. This may very well be the most terrifying financial crisis in history. For those who don't follow financial news, they might not be aware, but the stocks that surged last year, the ones you could blindly buy and still make big profits, have now begun to crash. For example, the leading stock NVD has dropped by 28%. Tesla, which has soared in October last year thanks to Trump's policies, has now reversed and plummeted 46%. Giants like Amazon, Facebook, Google, any big-name company you can think of, have all dropped at least 15% or more. This decline has thrown countless investors into a state of panic and doubt. But what if this is just the beginning? If the market continues to plunge, then overnight, countless leveraged investors could lose everything. They'll be forced to liquidate assets to cut losses, triggering a global asset sell-off. At that point, it's no longer just a price drop, it's a full-scale collapse. This has happened before, in 2000, 2008, and 2020. And now it's about to repeat. But the most terrifying part isn't the crash itself. It's the fact that this is exactly what the U.S. government wants to happen. Why? Because only in a recession does the whole world have to pay the price for America. Greetings, friends. Have you noticed that the Atlanta branch of the Federal Reserve once predicted that the U.S. GDP for Q1 would rise 2.3%? But by the end of last month, they revised that number to negative 1.5%. What does this mean? It means they're openly admitting that the U.S. has entered a recession. Just a few days later, the number was revised again, this time down to negative 2.8%. This means the U.S. isn't just in recession. The situation is far worse than originally predicted. So if the stock market soared when Trump was elected, it will nosedive once he takes office. Declaring a national recession is extremely sensitive in many countries, but even the U.S. government has openly admitted it. Many official economic indicators are telling us that things are getting worse. Lately, I feel like those elderly folks watching stock market news decades ago, glued to the screen, following Trump's every move to see what he'll do to the markets. Do you remember 4 or 5 years ago when a single Trump tweet could move the entire market? Back then, he constantly urged the Fed to print money to stimulate the economy, pushing the markets up strongly. But this time, he hasn't said a word about the stock market. Why? Just as I was about to turn off the TV, the U.S. Treasury Secretary appeared and declared that the government's main goal is to keep long-term bond yields from rising too high. Simply put, they want to ensure U.S. Treasury bonds can still be sold. What does this mean? Look at this chart. It shows how much money the Fed still has. You can see that since 2022, their wallet has been shrinking continuously. So what will they do? The answer: they'll borrow money from the wealthy. The Fed will use U.S. Treasury bonds as collateral to borrow money from financial institutions and the ultra-rich. This is called a reverse repo, repurchase agreement. In simple terms, this is the Fed borrowing from its own financial system. Look at this chart. The higher the blue line, the more bonds the Fed must pledge to get money. In other words, their borrowing capacity is being pushed to its limits. But the opposite is happening. The blue line is dropping to 0 this month. That means even the Fed can't borrow from its own financial institutions anymore. There are 2 possibilities. First, the institutions truly have no money left. And if they don't, how could they lend to the Fed? Second, even if they have money, they'd rather hold cash than accept Treasury bonds as collateral. So who will buy U.S. Treasury bonds now? Currently, the Fed's wallet is nearly empty. It can't even borrow money. Large investors in financial institutions either don't have money, or if they do, they're unwilling to buy treasuries. Meanwhile, countries like China, Japan, The UK and others have been dumping US bonds over the years. This means US treasuries are facing a liquidity crisis. In other words, they're no longer circulating normally in the market. Why? Because the number of people wanting to sell keeps growing, while buyers keep vanishing. That's why Trump's finance chief said their top priority is ensuring long-term U.S. treasuries can still be sold. The solution? Make America great again. For example, the government will cut staff, corporations will lay off workers to boost the unemployment rate, they'll raise tariffs to trigger higher domestic inflation, and most importantly, impose global sanctions, or even deliberately trigger a financial crisis or economic recession. They destroy first, then rebuild. That's how they plan to make America great again. But for us, this is not the time to waste a good crisis. When most countries can't escape this spiral, capital will flow into safe havens, the assets we've prepared in advance. This is our chance not only to protect our wealth, but to build a new generation of the rich. If you don't want to be a victim of this crisis, and instead want to rise to a higher economic class, follow my channel. I'll keep providing you with crucial information. And if you're afraid you'll forget what you just heard, hit the like button. This will automatically save the video to your playlist so you can come back and watch anytime. Now the question is, why has U.S. Treasury liquidity dried up? Isn't it simple for the U.S. to just use its own money to pay off debt? The answer is very simple. The U.S. dollar cannot be recycled. What does that mean? Listen carefully. U.S. Treasury bonds are essentially part of a borrow, spend, collect, repay cycle. For example, the Fed can print $5 trillion and use that money to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, essentially lending it to the U.S. government. Then the U.S. government spends that money to purchase goods from around the world, importing everything. Once the $5 trillion is spent, the U.S. government has no money left. So what happens next? This is where capitalism devised a strategy. The U.S. spends $5 trillion globally. If it can recover $4 trillion of that, then there is only $1 trillion left circulating globally, creating a shortage of dollars worldwide. As a result, other countries are forced to continue selling goods to the U.S. just to earn dollars. Then the U.S. can keep printing money and buying up the world's goods. So how does the U.S. get that money back? Simple, by borrowing it again. The U.S. sells treasury bonds and asks other nations to lend money to the U.S. government. When the U.S. makes profits, it promises to repay both principal and interest. This means that countries sell goods to the U.S., earn dollars, and then reinvest those dollars back into the U.S. In essence, Americans are working to repay the world with their own printed money. As a result, the world uses part of its earnings to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. The Fed prints $5 trillion. The U.S. government spends $5 trillion. It sells bonds to recover $4 trillion. This way, the world isn't flooded with too much money, and the Fed can print another $5 trillion. The U.S. government spends again, sells bonds to recover it, and prints more. Do you get the cycle? In other words, U.S. Treasury bonds are a mechanism that allows America to collect money from around the world. The goal is to buy all global goods without actually doing any real labor, just by printing dollars. That's why the U.S. national debt of $36 trillion, or even $100 trillion or $1 quadrillion, isn't really a problem. As long as around 40% of that debt is held by foreign lenders, the system still works. Put simply, as long as the U.S. can pull back the money it's spent, keep the world short on dollars, and ensure other countries still need dollars for trade, the U.S. can keep printing money without issue. Theoretically, if they can keep pulling money back via debt, the U.S. might never need to repay it. They can simply borrow new money to repay old debt. For example, if today the U.S. owes Japan $1 trillion and it comes due, the U.S. can ask, "Do you want to keep lending to me? I'll keep paying interest." If Japan agrees, the principal doesn't need to be repaid. If Japan declines, the U.S. will borrow $1 trillion from the UK to repay Japan. 30 years later, it'll find a way to repay the UK. This is called using time to buy space, or plainly, delay strategy. By dragging things out, the U.S. can reduce immediate repayment pressure. None of this is taught in textbooks. People often think simply, debt must be repaid. But in reality, debt can be delayed, even passed on to someone else. But if the world sells goods to the U.S., earns dollars, and doesn't reinvest that money into U.S. bonds, then the U.S. can't recover what it spent. That means it can't keep printing money. Without the ability to print, the U.S. would have to work, produce, and earn like other countries. That's what we mean by a liquidity crunch in U.S. bonds. And that's exactly what's happening now. In the past, 40 to 50% of U.S. debt was held by foreign nations. Now that number is only around 20 to 30%. That means the money the U.S. spent can no longer be reclaimed. If the money doesn't return, the world is no longer short on dollars. If the U.S. keeps printing now, the dollar will instantly devalue. That would make countries even less likely to use the dollar or buy U.S. bonds. Then money becomes even harder to recover. So what now? Some say Trump is trying hard to raise money to repay debt by increasing import tariffs or even selling U.S. citizenship. With just $5 million, you can become a U.S. citizen and immigrate. It's almost a global joke. But as mentioned earlier, U.S. debt doesn't really need to be repaid, and in fact, can't be repaid. If the U.S. truly paid back its debt, the entire global financial system would collapse. Why? Suppose Trump succeeds in drawing all global money back to the U.S. If he then uses that money to repay debt, the money exits the system again. Worse still, the biggest creditor to the U.S. is the Federal Reserve. Previously, the Fed printed money and lent it to the U.S. government. If the U.S. pays it back now, that money is essentially destroyed, removed from circulation. Why does the U.S. need to print money? Because earning money through labor is too hard. So instead, they print money, sell treasury bonds to pull that money back in, then print more. If the U.S. stops selling bonds and starts trying to repay debt, it will no longer be able to print more money. Therefore, the U.S. doesn't need to repay its debt. Why should it? If the U.S. dares to reduce its debt, it would essentially be destroying itself. Because if the U.S. collects $100 million and uses that to repay debt that didn't even need to be repaid in the first place, it will run out of money. When the U.S. runs out of money, the issue isn't just a stock market crash. Wall Street itself would shut down due to a total liquidity freeze. If no one has money, businesses will have no customers, and the economy will grind to a halt. At that point, the dream many people hope for might come true. Houses in the heart of American cities might cost just $100. But that's because the economy has entered deflation. By then, most people's assets would have also collapsed in value, worth only $1. Banks would also have no money to lend for home purchases. In other words, even if home prices plummet, asset values fall just as hard. Most people would still feel homes are too expensive and unaffordable. So don't think that U.S. debt repayment and deflation are good things. It would only mean American assets are sold at rock-bottom prices while U.S. citizens become much poorer. That's why you must understand one thing. No U.S. president will ever dare to truly repay the national debt. Debt repayment is just a slogan for TV audiences. The real mission of the U.S. government is to maintain control over the issuance of money, pull in dollars from around the world, and keep printing more. In other words, expand public debt. Put differently, as U.S. debt grows, the amount of money printed increases. The U.S. dollar keeps losing value. When money is pumped into the market, there must be assets to absorb it. Otherwise, uncontrolled inflation will occur, driving asset prices sky high. So what's the advantage of small investors over big players like Warren Buffett? Flexibility. Buffett might have to prepare a year in advance to buy or sell assets. We, on the other hand, can just wait for a clear signal, when money starts pouring in and stock prices rise, then enter. It's not too late. In short, big players create the trend. We follow the trend, make our profit, and exit. Now listen carefully. If you don't understand this part, you won't grasp what's coming next. Right now, the U.S. can no longer pull money back in. The world has stopped lending to the U.S. Without money returning, the U.S. can no longer print more. So what do? Simple. Something everyone has experienced. Raise interest rates. If you once lent me $1 million and I paid $10,000 in interest, but you no longer want to lend, now I'll offer you $50,000 in interest so you earn more. That's exactly what the U.S. did. It successfully attracted money from around the world back again. However, the consequence is this. Most people only buy short-term U.S. bonds now. No one wants long-term bonds. Meanwhile, as the U.S. stock market rises, more people jump in to speculate, pushing prices even higher. If you want to understand this better, check out the video we posted every Monday. Each one connects closely to the next. In short, the current result is that the U.S. has pulled back all the dollars from around the world. But that money didn't go to the U.S. government. It went into the U.S. stock market, into the hands of capitalists. As mentioned earlier, the U.S. uses government bonds to attract global funds without having to repay immediately. They borrow for 30 years, then use that to pay off short-term debt. That's borrowing long to repay short. But now, while short-term bonds still have buyers, long-term bonds have no takers. No one wants to lend the U.S. money for 30 years anymore. That means the U.S. model of borrowing long-term to pay short-term no longer works. When this mechanism collapses, the U.S. will be forced to keep repaying short-term debts at high interest rates. For example, in 2025, the U.S. will have about $8 trillion in maturing debt that must be paid. It also needs to borrow another $2 trillion in new debt. But right now, the national treasury only has about $600 billion, an amount that's not even enough to cover basic budget expenses, let alone debt repayment. There is no money left to repay debt. The U.S. could choose to print more money. But as mentioned earlier, if dollars haven't been fully pulled back and they print prematurely, the value of the dollar would plummet instantly, turning it into nothing more than worthless paper. So what will the U.S. do? This is the key point. The U.S. Treasury Secretary recently declared that the most important mission now is to sell long-term bonds. What does this mean? In the past, when I spoke about this, many mocked me, accusing me of spreading fear. But now even Wall Street analysts are saying exactly the same things I said before. Traders in the U.S. are preparing for a stock market crash to divert capital into long-term bonds. Why would they do that? Because if the U.S. wants to keep printing money without actually repaying debt, there's only one way. Force capital out of the stock market and into long-term bonds. But how do they do that? One branch of the Federal Reserve recently stated that U.S. GDP will be negative. Meanwhile, most economic indicators show that the U.S. has already entered a recession. Why? Let's say you're running a business in the U.S. After Trump imposed tariffs, your import costs skyrocketed, so you had to raise prices. Now, average Americans can't afford your products, inventory piles up, and your business risks collapse. If you survive that, congratulations. But then Trump deports illegal immigrants, cutting off your cheap labor supply. Now you're forced to hire Americans, meaning your wage expenses surge multiple times over. If you still manage to stay afloat by working with the government, thinking public contracts are secure, well, bad news, Trump also announced a $1 trillion cut to government spending. Now you're in trouble again and have to seek public sector jobs. But just as you feel stable, Trump announces massive layoffs of civil servants to save money. So you turn to big corporations like Amazon or Facebook. But even these giants are laying off workers in droves. The result? Even elite professionals are losing jobs en masse. Now, what happens to your mortgage or car loan? With no income, how do you pay your debts? Right now, U.S. credit card default rates have risen to levels similar to the 2008 financial crisis. So you see, Trump shouts, "Make America great again." But what he's really doing is pushing the U.S. deeper into recession. Why? It's simple. The U.S. manipulates the narrative about recession. They keep declaring that the U.S. economy is about to collapse, sending a message that even the strongest economy on earth is in decline. That implies there's no truly safe investment left. No matter what you invest in, you'll likely lose money. In such a high-risk environment, U.S. government bonds, with their high and stable interest rates, start to look extremely attractive. So what should you do? Quickly move your money into U.S. bonds, and not just any bonds, long-term bonds, because current interest rates are 4 to 5%. And if you buy now, you lock in that rate for the next 30 years. If you wait and others rush to buy, yields will drop and prices will rise, meaning you'll have to pay more for the same bonds in the future. That's why a frenzy has started, investors racing to grab U.S. long-term bonds. From here, 3 possible scenarios could unfold. Scenario 1, the ideal outcome. U.S. long-term bonds sell successfully without the stock market crashing. If this happens, everything remains balanced. But as mentioned before, stocks and bonds are like two ends of a seesaw. When money flows into bonds, stocks lose liquidity. To keep both markets stable, a huge amount of capital would be required. So the stock market would need to decline gradually, while money is continually pumped in to support it. This scenario is possible, but not very likely. Scenario 2, more likely, U.S. bonds soar because everyone is buying, but the stock market crashes fast like it did in 2008 and 2020. In that case, the U.S. could recover dollars from bond sales, letting the Federal Reserve expand its balance sheet and print more money freely. The newly printed money could then be loaned to major financial institutions at near zero interest, so they can buy stocks at bargain prices and lift the market back up. This is exactly why Warren Buffett and major institutions are holding huge piles of cash, because whether it's scenario 1 or 2, the stock market must drop first. Scenario 3, the worst case. The stock market collapses, but no capital flows into U.S. bonds. Now both bonds and stocks crash together. At that point, the U.S. economy would fall into a deep and prolonged recession. Why? Because if U.S. bonds can't be sold, the government can't recover money, meaning they can't expand the Fed's balance sheet and can't print more money to save the market. If they print anyway, stocks might recover, but the dollar's value would tank. Imagine you invest in U.S. stocks and make 30% profit, but the dollar loses 40% of its value. You're actually down 10% in real terms. This would trigger massive panic. Why? Because many countries around the world still hold huge dollar reserves. If dollar-denominated assets crash, the entire global economy will be shaken. A full-blown global crisis could be triggered. So why is Trump willingly damaging the U.S. economy? In reality, he's putting a knife to the world's throat, sending a message. If you buy U.S. bonds, everything will be fine. But if you don't and the U.S. falls, the entire world goes down with it. If a global crisis spreads, what will other nations do? They'll have to prioritize saving the U.S. first, because saving America means saving themselves. Just remember 2008. The crisis started in the U.S. and spread globally, yet America recovered the fastest. After all, the U.S. is still the U.S. But again, remember this. If you truly understand how the market operates, you won't just make money. You'll make it faster than ever before in history. Some people might say I'm just making things up. Honestly, I don't blame them. Maybe they're new to this. But at the very least, go back and watch my previous videos. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm not showing off. All I want is to remind everyone what risks are out there right now. And more importantly, what opportunities we, as investors, are seeing. With whatever little influence I have, I just hope I can help those who are willing to listen. Avoid this financial crisis. I also want to tell you something else. Back in 2008, many people were just construction workers or waiters at a hot pot restaurant, but today, a lot of them have become wealthy. After 2008, the gap between rich and poor was locked in. Those former waiters, now they don't even need to work. Their assets generate income constantly. Some earn more in a month or even an hour than most people make in a lifetime. I was too young back then. I missed that wave, but this time might be different. Now I'm older, and more importantly, I'm ready. I've rolled up my sleeves. If the opportunity comes, I won't miss it. And if it doesn't, that's fine too. We'll just adjust the strategy. In the coming weeks, we'll be watching the U.S. bond market closely. But this isn't a long-term strategy. It's a short-term, speculative move. Like I said earlier, if U.S. bonds are rescued, the government can print more money, and bond prices may skyrocket. But if they can't be rescued, then what? That's why our strategy is simple. Get in fast, get out faster. Take profit, then leave, just like guerrilla warfare. If anything in today's video wasn't clear, I suggest you go back and rewatch the last 2 or 3 videos I posted on Mondays. All of my content is logically connected, so it'll make more sense. The market has been very volatile lately, but due to time constraints, I'll stop here. I share free knowledge on how to become wealthy, build a business, invest wisely, and eventually achieve financial freedom. So if you don't want to miss out, follow my channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with others. To everyone who liked this video, thank you. I truly hope you'll reach financial freedom soon. And if today you found just 1 or 2 helpful insights that can make your life a little better, then I'm already more than satisfied.